I'd like to take a moment to share with you a nice conversation with a new client. It's my hope that what I shared with her is a help to you the way it was to her. She's 56 years old. She is in a 35-year marriage. She said to me, Doc, we have several children. We've got grandchildren. And I'm coming to you because at this phase of my life, I'm really struggling with what to do next as it relates to my marriage, specifically how to handle and manage my husband. I said, what do you mean by handle and manage your husband? She said, well, he doesn't talk often, but when he does, he doesn't own a single thing that is going on. He has an incredibly difficult time taking accountability and responsibility. He loves to argue when he does talk. So he will talk, though not much, but when he does, he loves to argue. And a part of his arguing mechanism for arguing is not owning things. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, he just doesn't own his responsibility. In any role or disagreement or challenge that we have, we've had several, as you would imagine, over 35 years, we've had several different challenges as a couple, but he struggles to own his part in those challenges. And he would tell you if he were on screen that I am the first to own my errors. And if I'm being honest with you, Doc, I believe I'm the reason why this marriage has stayed together as long as it has. I said, well, that's very interesting. I said, well, how does he handle these disagreements that you all have? She said, well, he just simply doesn't own anything. He refuses to own anything. He refuses to take accountability and responsibility for anything. And not only that, but when we are having conversations and going back and forth, he talks in circles. I said, what do you mean by that? She said, well, he's just the master at avoiding topics and conversations in a very direct way. Instead of him directly addressing a matter that is on hand as it relates to a conversation or a disagreement that we're having, he'll go what she called all the way around the mountain, thinking he's covering a situation, but he's really just avoiding the situation. It almost feels like he's attempting to deflect the real issue at hand, and through that deflection, just fill me up with a bunch of information that has nothing to do with nothing. And she started laughing and she said, Doc, I know that sounds crazy. I said, no, it doesn't actually. It doesn't sound crazy at all. And it sounds familiar, but we'll get into that. I said, man, one final question. I said, why isn't he then on this counseling call? She said, well, I did ask him if he would be willing for both of us to meet and have a conversation about this with you. I shared with him your information. About 3 days later, he came back to me and said, I like what he says, but I don't think he's a good fit for me. I said, well, ma'am, that's fair. I don't get in the business of forcing people to think that I'm a good fit for them. I'm not for everybody and everybody's not for me. And that's okay. I said, but let's get into this conversation about him and just understand what's going on. I said, the fact that he doesn't want to talk to me doesn't bother me. I said, was he willing and open to talk to and engage another counselor, therapist, coach? She said, no, he didn't want to talk to anybody else. He at least reviewed your information, but he said, I just don't think he's a good fit for me. I said, great. I said, ma'am, do you know what a blame shifter is? She said, I've definitely heard the term, and I'm sure I could kind of put two and two together. She said, it's a person in essence who doesn't accept responsibility. I said, you're exactly right. That's a very simple definition of blame shifting is a person who passes the accountability or responsibility for their behavior onto someone else. Anytime you're dealing with a blame shifter, you're dealing with someone who, instead of owning accountability and responsibility for their behavior, they pass along the accountability, the responsibility for their behavior on to another person. And typically, this is a person that they believe in some sort or fashion is either really truly responsible for what's going on, which I don't believe this is the case here for all of this that you've described as it relates to your problems and challenges in your marriages, or it is someone that they pass it along to that they believe they are able to pass it on to. She put her pen down. She said, Doc, what you're saying to me is that he's in essence manipulating me by not accepting responsibility or accountability because he knows I'm going to accept the manipulation. I said, that's a mighty fine way to put it. I said, one of the key things that we ignore about blame shifters is that they tend not to push blame in directions where they don't sense, whether through evidence or otherwise, that the person that they're trying to push the blame onto would not be willing to do what? She said, to accept it. I said, this is good. I said, understand this about blame shifters. They are absolutely masters at functioning in what's vague, what's unclear, and what's redundant. They're great at that because when you get into the specifics of a matter with a blame shifter, it forces them to look responsibility and accountability in the face. And so when you're engaging with them, they may very well be very vague in how they communicate with you. They may not be clear and very direct with how they engage with you. They may master in the minor, where you're conversating with them and having disagreements with them. And instead of them dealing with the point at hand, they'll find a smaller point that has really nothing majorly to do with what you're discussing. And they'll do what? She said they'll emphasize the smaller point. He does it all the time. We could be having a disagreement about what to do with our finances as it relates to thinking about retirement. And I'll mention something to him about switching banks because maybe we could get a better interest rate at a bank. And instead of him focusing on what we should be dealing with, he'll go on a 15-minute diatribe about the banks. I said, ma'am, that's exactly what blame shifters do. They find the smallest things that have nothing to do with the large things or the matters at hand in order to skew your attention away from where the focus should really be. I said, and so because of this, there is a major sign of blame shifting that is very underrated, by the way, that a lot of people miss when it comes to working with blame shifters or being connected to blame shifters. And I said, it's this. You might watch them say a whole lot of nothing and yet think they're saying a whole lot of something at the same time. I said, ma'am, this is going to sound like a crazy question, but when he's giving you these lectures about switching banks instead of dealing with the financial matters that you all have, I said, how's his demeanor and posture? She said, oh, you would think he was doing a lecture at a university. She said it, and I started laughing. I never forgot that line. I said, I get exactly what you're getting at. Some big shot that's lecturing you on the importance of a bank when really the 10, 15 minutes he spent talking about banking or different banks or choosing different banks does not even have much to do with anything at all as it relates to the greater financial decisions that you all have to make about retirement. Correct? She said, that's exactly it. And he goes on and on and on. And he has this egotistical, her words, posture about him in describing these small matters that really have nothing to do with the matter at hand. I said, ma'am, that is the underrated sign of a blame shifter. They will literally say a whole lot of nothing, but act as if they're saying a whole lot of something at the same time. And this is in order to shift blame. They will do this to avoid direct conversations. And you've got to be careful with this. She says, so then, Doc, how do I deal with it? I said, well, I'm glad you asked. Let's consider bill collectors. And I want you to think about an analogy that's going to sound weird until it makes sense. I said, ma'am, blame shifters are like people who avoid bill collectors. She said, how? I said, ma'am, have you ever tried to avoid a bill collector? She started laughing, said, Doc, don't call me out. I said, just a question, no judgment. She said, I have. I said, perfect. I said, what happens when you avoid a bill collector? She said, well, that bill collector is going to keep calling. I said, and then what else is going to happen? She said, well, that bill collector might start sending mail notifications. I said, great. I said, well, what else is going to happen? She said, well, the bill collector might even sell off the bill to another organization. I said, and then what's going to happen when they do that? She said, that organization is going to call. I said, perfect. And what else are they going to do? She said, they may send you some things in the mail. I said, perfect. What else are they going to do? She said, Doc, I get where you're going. I said, I want to go a bit further with this. I said, if you've ever been on the tail end of any of this behavior, you recognize that this behavior, this constant, consistent behavior from the bill collector does two very critical things. Number one, it increases frustration. That the person that they're trying to collect their money from over time is going to get frustrated. I said, but notice something. Their frustration does not do what? She said, it doesn't stop the calls, which means a good bill collector is going to stick to the matter at hand, even if it frustrates the person who's trying to avoid what they owe. She put her pen down, put her hand over her face and said, that's insanity. I said, ma'am, it gets better. I said, not only does this happen when you avoid a bill collector, I said, the other thing that happens is the fees increase. I said, ma'am, you know as well as I do, you can run from a bill collector, but guess what ain't going to happen? She said, that debt ain't going away. I said, and not only is the debt not going away, but you're going to end up owing more money in the end because you've avoided the truth than you would have had to pay if you would have just dealt with it head on. I said, ma'am, your husband is the person avoiding the bill collector. You're the bill collector. And because he's refusing to address these matters, Understand this, that his avoidance does not eliminate his obligation or your obligation to address what needs to be addressed. He can run from it all day. He can talk around it all day. He can talk circles around it all day. I said, but ma'am, just because he's avoiding it does not mean you need to stop pressing the issue. And I said, I know a lot of people will say, oh, don't press the issue, just let it be. I said, well, ma'am, that's probably what you've done after 35 years. I would imagine that if this has been going on, as you say, since within the first 5 years of your marriage, the only reason it lasted this long is because in many ways you've allowed him to talk around matters and not press him. I said, ma'am, you got to press him because he needs to understand that those fees ain't going nowhere. I said, and this is really easy. There are 3 ways you can handle blame shifters. Number 1, be specific. When you're talking to him, you need to be direct. No gray, no back and forth like the Aaliyah record. When you're dealing with the matter at hand, deal with the matter and be direct about the matter. Don't allow him to just dance around the topic. Stick to the topic, even if it frustrates him, even if it angers him, even if it upsets him, because a bill collector does not call you to talk about how your day was walking around the park, do they? She started laughing and said, no, sir. I said, so then if a bill collector ain't calling you to talk about your day at the park, then why do you allow him, when you guys are having disagreements, to talk about everything else but the matter at hand? I said, so with blame shifters, you got to be direct. There ain't no gray. Number 2, you got to be clear. There should be no ambiguity. There should be no room for guessing. You need to be clear with him about what the issues are. Be clear about the part of those issues that you own, and be clear about the part of those issues that he needs to take responsibility for. So there is no ambiguity. There is no room for guessing or second guessing. He's very much aware. I said, and thirdly, ma'am, you need to be detailed. I said, ma'am, I've never got a bill from anybody, bill collector or nobody else, that did not have great detail about what I owed, when I owed it, how much I owed, how long it's been outstanding, when I had to pay it, who I need to pay it to, the methods of which I need to pay it, the amounts of time that I have in order to pay it, on and on and on. I said, does that make sense? She said, yeah. I said, so when you're dealing with a person who's a blame shifter, you got to get into details. Why? Because they don't like the details. And this is why they dance around matters, because they recognize that dancing around matters helps them to avoid the details. And guess where personal accountability and responsibility lives? She said, Doc, in the details. I said, exactly. Great conversation. We had that conversation. She went back to him to have a few conversations with him about his willingness to own some things. And he's made up in his mind that he is not going to face these matters head on, that he's going to continue to address things the way he does because it's comfortable for him. And she's now going through her values to determine if this is a marriage and a situation she wants to continue to be a part of. I hope this story made sense. If it did, type church in the comments with 3 R's. And then remember, you've got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you. What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Zeb. Listen, I've been dying to make this announcement for a very long time now, and I'm pleased to say that Inspire Nation has officially launched. Yes, we finally got a Facebook and YouTube community group where we're going to have exclusive content, exclusive shorts, exclusive discussion prompts, where we're going to engage with other people literally around the world who are on the same healing journey that we're on. I need you to go find these pages right now on Facebook and YouTube. Inspire Nation, follow the page, join the group, introduce yourself, and be prepared to link up with literally thousands of people around the world who are on the same healing journey, who are looking for the same resources, and who want to also be surrounded with other like-minded individuals who are growing in the same direction as you are. I'm so excited about this because it's the beginning of some great things I can't talk about right now. Listen, you got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you.